Hello and welcome to the SCP podcast series. Today we are on the Fundamentals of Consulting Psychology Authors podcast, and we're interviewing two authors of a very important book in the series. Book is Ethical Practice of Consulting Psychology, and we have doctors Rodney Lowman and Stewart Cooper on, the two authors, the co-authors of that book. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here and telling us a little bit about yourselves and the book. I guess the first question is, especially with two of you, what is your background, each of you, and how did you come together, perhaps, and to write this book?
So, my interest in ethics started early in my career as a professional psychologist when I had the interesting experience of serving on the ethics committee of the American Psychological Association, and additionally, as head of the professional affairs committee, as it was then called, of SIOP, Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology. I was the initiator of a project that became um, a major case book in applying ethics codes to the practice of psychology in organizations. And so that's my origin story on this. And Stuart,
Yeah.
yours?
What I would say in terms of the consulting psychology, generally on that, my doctorate is in counseling psychology, but the program have an emphasis on workplace psychology and particularly a sub-emphasis on consultation theory and practice. And so that led me into becoming involved with the Society for Consulting Psychology, Division 13 as it was called at the time. And then when the last iteration of the code was being developed, I was chair of what they call the Education and Training Committee of SCP. And so I was sent for 3 years to be the liaison to the writing of the code at that time. And so that was a very important part of that process to try to align the code better with consulting psychology than it had been in the previous code. And so that was a real introduction to the ethics course. And then within my graduate program in psychology, I taught the consultation course for many years. And so ethics was one of the units that was always covered in that. And so we'll be able to bring it in that way. The other source is that, along with my colleague Rodney here, we co-presented for many years at the National SCP annual conference ethics seminars, both a beginning seminar, foundational seminar, and also an advanced ethics seminar. And then for the last several years, I've been involved as a liaison from two groups to the current writing of the revision of the ethics code, one from SCP itself, and then the other from what is now called the Committee for the Advancement of General Applied Psychology. And so I'm heading the effort for that group that we will be having some response to the ethics code once it's released for public comment.
Wow, that clearly you two are experts in this. And I'd like to ask, before I get into the book in 1 second here, I'd love to ask, what is the difference between consulting psychology ethics and other ethics for other psychology?
So we all are governed, those who are in the American Psych Association, or in most cases who have a psychology license in the US, we're governed by the same ethics code, which is that of the American Psychological Association. But the code had its origin in a way that dealt more with individual level issues than it did with group or organizational or consulting issues. And so we don't see a difference in the basic principles that apply to consulting psychology. But if you think you can just read the code, you know the code exists, so you don't need to tell us any more about it. And you'll be skilled in dealing with the kind of things that happen in consulting psychology, which are often very complicated, where you have multiple folks that you have to deal with and get permission of, and they may not always be consistent. And so they're similar in principle, and in the code itself, they're different in how the code applies in many complex situations.
And I think I would add a couple places where that you see that in the 2003 code. One is in the multiple relationships area. We were very influential in that section being revised from the previous edition of that, because in consulting psychology, multiple roles are the norm, not the exception. And so what was there before was really impractical for consulting psychologists. And then the second one is one that was a standard that was specifically developed for consulting psychology. It's standard 3.11, and it stands for, consulting to and through organizations. So it basically takes the entry phase of the consultation process and suggests the multiple elements of that need to be looked at. And it's just so very important, because if you look from an ethical point of view, if you start off with a highly problematic and get, kind of beginning, it's going to go downhill and be worse as it manifests. And at least if you have a good building, you're less likely to run into problems as the project unfolds.
And just, Joanie, to add one quick note, when we think about consulting psychology, we think about the concept of levels, that people are often dealing at the individual level, the group level, or teams level, and the organizational level. And within each of those, with assessment and interventions. And so all of those boxes have to be considered in most applications in consulting psychology when you're working in the context of organizations.
Yeah, and I would suggest, and we're going to get into it later on in terms of the book and how to get a hold of it, but there's a chart on page 8 of the book that really lays a visual out for this. So on one side of the cube, there's the individual, group, and organizational level. Across the face of the cube, there's a number of issues such as confidentiality and competence. And then on the other side is the two major foci for most consultation, either assessment or intervention. And it's not uncommon to have the two combined in a given consultancy.
Right. And I just say, for people who aren't consultants or who are new to this field, some of what we're talking about, this multiple relationship, is that often if you are dealing at one level, say you're coaching a leader, your client might be somebody else, not the actual person you're coaching. And so you have these multiple relationships, as opposed to in a clinical situation, often you would have the individual as your client, but sometimes that could also be an organization as well.
So, and Joanie, in the example you just mentioned, in clinical work, a lot of psychologists work at the individual level, but a better analogy for consulting psych would be family um, therapists and psychologists, because you have their multiple levels, or school psychologists. But in consulting psychology, you have all those levels. I won't say all the time, but a whole lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's go into the book. I love it, Stewart, that you've already gotten us into one of the key areas there that helps describe it. So what is the book about? And maybe you have a takeaway that we should be considering before we actually go and read it.
So the book is about what it says in the title, The Ethical Practice of Consulting Psychology. And that little matrix I just talked about, individual, group, organizational, assessment, and intervention, that's the backbone of the book. So there are chapter related to individual level issues, such as people who are working primarily in coaching, where the person being coached is paying for the services themselves. At the group or team level, how are things different? And then also at the organizational level.
And I would add to that, then we, throughout those chapters, foundational chapters, we give case examples, and then we talk about what the applicable standards are from the 2003 code for that. And then toward the end of the book, though, we move into kind of emerging areas. So one that, and again, the book is a few years old now, but one of the ones we picked even at that time was technology. And it has done nothing but increase astronomically since that time. So good example is, how do you know if you're doing right now, most assessments are done virtually, not in person. How do you know the person who's taking the test is the person taking the test? And how do you know they're not having some auxiliary aid on emotional intelligence, on another screen as they're taking it, for example? And so it gets into the technology section, gets into some of the just really many challenges that exist in consulting psychology in terms of the use of technology. And then there's another chapter on regulation. Because of the 10th Amendment here in the United States, we have 50 psychology licensure laws, and then more given the territories. And how does that play out as far as where you're practicing and what you're doing? What areas of consulting psychology are ones that do come under the purview of state laws? Which ones are ones that are exempt from that? And it's certainly an area that's not been really resolved well at the national or state level.
Well, one of the things that I thought was just really enticing for me about the book is that it's not just a listing of rules and regulations and all that. It's really written in an accessible way with examples and for people who are in the field trying to get some work done. And what does this really mean to have an ethical dilemma? What kinds of things are important? And the examples just are really, interesting and important. And they help illuminate what all of the rules and codes and all that mean.
And to add to that a little bit of context, Stewart and I, for many years, have done workshops, as he mentioned, at the annual meeting of the Society of Consulting Psychology, its midwinter conference, and also at the American Psychological Association. And each of us have also done workshops at other for other organizations as well. But in each case, we make cases that are provided by the participants an important part of those. And we find that the best learning is not just didactic, it is dealing with cases and trying to deal with it in terms of, well, how does the code apply? And if it's ambiguous how it applies, what do you do about that? That's really, in our experience anyway, it's very impactful to have case material to work with, because that takes it from what can be pretty theoretical and dry to very real type situations that people encounter with the cases that are included in the book.
And I would add another, in a sense, justification or pitch for why this is something somebody should read is that, most people who look at ethics operate out of kind of a fear thing. I don't want to run afoul of the ethics and get into trouble. But actually, if you look at best practice, the idea of ethics is to help you practice better to achieve superior outcomes. And so really, if people want to be on the top of their game, really understanding the ethics code can help people be on the top of their game.
I love a business case for ethics as well. Yeah, for so many reasons, but just doing good work. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what else is going on with ethics? I mean, to some extent, ethical principles are pretty consistent, but we've got changes, like you were talking about technology, we've got changes in ethical codes at APA. I mean, how can you just talk a little bit about what's new and different, or to the extent that it is?
Sure. Stewart mentioned earlier that he was involved as a liaison in the last revision of the code, and for a while was liaison to the current group. APA has a task force on the ethics code. It's called ECTF, Ethics Code Task Force, which is charged with revising the code in a way that will be both innovative and have impact. So I am a member of that task force, and I must say it's not a short-term process. I think we're in year 5 now of this, with the end not yet in sight. So there will be a lot to think about as that code gets rolled out for comment, and ultimately when it we think gets approved by the APA Council. But I think one of the things that the task force was charged with was bringing in some of these areas to the code that really weren't thought about for example, Stewart mentioned technology, and Joanie, you've written a lot about that as well in your own writing and your own practice. But one of the examples that I won't say it didn't exist because it did, but it didn't have the um, focus that it currently does is artificial intelligence. And just to give you an example of that, as psychologists involved in doing personnel selection and coming up with uh, measures and assessment approaches that are valid and reliable for their intended inferences, um, what happens if it's a AI bot, a robot that is making the decisions? And what if those decisions are biased against people because it's relying on publicly available information in various apps, social media presence, etc.? What's the role of psychologists in that? Is it okay to use artificial intelligence if you're advising on selection? What about a virtual coach? And is that okay for a psychologist to make use of?
Well, do you have answers for that? Does the book provide answers for that, or is this something new that you'll be
Well,
covering in?
on AI in particular, as Stuart mentioned, the book came out a few years ago, so that's not a primary focus, but general uses of technology are. But one of the things we're finding in the emerging thoughts about ethics, it's not so much that the ethics need an overhaul to deal with something like artificial intelligence. We need, however, to think about how do we advise on situations where we may be part of helping to determine whether or not an app is biased against people of a particular race or gender, et cetera. Um, how do we help organizations become um, careful and thoughtful in their integration of artificial intelligence into their organization? As psychologists, we're not typically the decision makers about what an organization is going to do in the area of using AI, but we can be the trusted advisors and we can help them think through how do you integrate this new approach. It's not really new, but approach on steroids compared to what it once was into an organization in a way that is going to minimize legal risks and ethical risk, and be fair for what the intended purposes of the process are.
I think I'd like to comment too on terms of if you look at these ethics codes, they're never done in a vacuum. They're always done in a societal and a historical context. That's that's in the room as they are done. And there have been a lot of changes since 2003 in society, and so the current code has some certain areas that they're going to be really emphasizing. I was the liaison from the board of directors for 3 years or 2 years to the to the ethics committee, so I had exposure that way as well as being kind of a liaison to the ECTF now. And so I think, how does that play out with consultation? And that's, again, there's going to be a iterative process once it goes to the open comment period to, in a sense, optimize this being kind of the best code it can be by giving the feedback, because no group of 8 or 10 people can think of everything. And so if you have hundreds of people looking at something, then the end product will be better and will be something that can really handle the incredible complexity, the range of where all consulting psychologists work even in itself is amazing. I'll give you one example. Most of us are aware that most medications have 3 names. They have 2 technical names and then kind of a popular name. It's psychologists who tend to be the consultants on the popular name. And so it's an area of a purchase of expertise consultation about why things are named soft text, for example. That they're named, the popular names are given for reasons.
Right. And yeah, I think a lot of psychologists do work in marketing, or a lot of people in marketing have some psychology backgrounds too, which is, yeah, another application yet. Absolutely. So you're talking about revisions in the code and new technologies. How can we glean from this book and on the current changes? What can we get from it? As well as, are you going to be writing a revision or a part two, or is that necessary?
Well, I think it will indeed be necessary to have a revision, but I think, as with other ethics books that are integrated with the APA ethics code, probably a lot are waiting until the new code version comes out because they want to see what those changes are and how they apply and so forth. But there's plenty in the book now that is useful and will remain useful, because a lot of the things, they're the same issues. It just gets more complicated. How do you resolve them? For example, in the case of informed consent, um, one of the approaches that psychologists are ethically obligated to do when they're assessing people or putting them through a research study or whatever is to advise people so that they can make an informed choice as to whether or not they want to participate. Well, what does that mean in a consulting psychology context when you have individuals, groups, and the organization itself? If you're thinking about a study that's done with psychology intro psych students for research credits, usually it's one person that's getting and signing the informed consent. How do you get informed consent from a team, for example? And what is the psychologist's obligation to do that? And what happens when you have the organization itself that is considered the client? Well, who is going to consent for the organization? Chances are, if you're working with a major corporation, the CEO of the company is not going to be signing off on giving consent. So, what is informed consent at the organizational level? What does it consist of at the team level? And how do you explain what the risks and so forth are? Those are things I think the book currently, in its current version, is helpful to deal with.
Yeah, I would
What do you
really
think
agree.
about?
Yeah, I would really agree with Rodney here on that. I think the framework that the book has is going to remain the same. I think it's this particulars like AI, for example, that how that will play out. There'll be certain issues that are there that play out, but the framework is still one that's there. And also, I think another area that we have a little bit of attention to is decision making, because there's been a literature that has grown in terms of ethical decision making that's gone kind of way beyond the simply consult with colleagues, step 1, 2, 3, 4, and particularly looking at ethical pitfalls. There are certain characteristics of situations that make it more likely someone will not think clearly. And they'll go into what they call type 1 thinking versus type 2, rapid thinking versus kind of more deliberate thinking. And so we have some that's in the book. And I think I agree with Rodney. Once the code's out, a revision definitely would be needed. And that would be an area where there would be more content, because there's been a lot of research in ethical decision making since 2003.
Well, it is a fundamentals series, so it sounds like getting the fundamentals of ethics, ethical issues in consulting psychology would be a good place to go, even if there is another book that comes out. So how do we get the book? Where is it available? Yeah.
So, this is the book. The Ethical Practice of Consulting Psychology. It is published by the American Psychological Association, and you can buy it in several ways. First of all, the book is available both in a softcover version and an ebook version, and you can get either one of those. And you can order them either through apa.org, which is the American Psych Association's website. And if you order through there, you can, for I think the rest of this year of 2023, if you use in caps the discount code FLYER25, you'll be able to get a 25% discount. And I think it includes free shipping. So, or you can order it on Amazon or through bookstores and the like. And if you are a student or a faculty member, you can also, if your library has a research database that includes something called APA Books, you can download the chapters for your own personal use that way without having to pay extra for that. So there are a variety of ways to get this content.
Great. Well, thank you both. This has been really informative, and I really appreciate you both being able to contribute to our podcast for the book authors, and wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. And this is a good way to help people get a little bit behind the book before, as they make that decision, whether they want to buy it or read it in one way or the other. We hope they do.
Yeah. And well, for people who are watching or listening, this is only one of the series. We have several other books in the Fundamentals of Consulting Psychology book series, and we have other interviews with authors as well. So feel free to tune in and listen to other episodes as well. So thank you, Rodney and Stewart, and all of our viewers and listeners.
Thanks.
Thank you.